Hello, my name is Tara Lutman Agacayak. I'm a digital marketing consultant and book writing facilitator. I support women writing books, and I'm so pleased today to have Elmira Bayrasli here to talk about the book she's written, From the Other Side of the World. She's also the co-founder of Foreign Policy Interrupted, and I'm going to ask her about her book and this organization that she started through the process of our conversation today. We're so lucky to be in this converted, restored Yalı on the Bosphorus in Istanbul, beautiful place. And we are very fortunate to have Elmira in town for just a few days to have this conversation about the book that she's created and launched. And I'm very, very happy. She's a dear friend of mine and glad to share this conversation with you. So with that, I will begin by asking you the question, where did the idea for this book come from? How did it call to you? What was happening in your life that compelled you to write this book?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm really happy to talk about how the book started, because it started with a process of my own personal story. My parents are Turkish immigrants to the United States. I grew up very much in two worlds of Turkey and the United States, going between the two of them, and always seeing the differences between the two of them, and always questioning why Turkey was always so far behind, and really trying to understand why my parents made the very hard decision of immigrating to the United States. And the reason behind that was because there were very few opportunities in Turkey. At the time, it was the 1960s in Turkey, when Turkey's economy was struggling. And so they made the very hard decision to come to the United States so that not only could they have opportunities, but they could provide better opportunities for their children. Growing up as the child of immigrants, I was always very aware of the world and therefore very interested in what was going on in the world. And what I saw going on in the world was a lot of people trying to replicate the American success story, trying to replicate the opportunities that we had in the United States. And so I became very interested in the process of how you do that. Initially, I thought that process really began with government. I studied political science at New York University. I got my master's degree in Turkish studies at Columbia University. And I thought with that, I could actually go to the government and work on the issues that I was passionate about, international affairs. What I discovered in the process of a decade-long career working in government at the State Department and then at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Bosnia was that there were a lot of barriers that the government put up, and there was a lot of bureaucracy and process that I actually didn't want to be involved in that. I actually wanted to be involved with the people and making an impact on them. And the impact that people kept telling me about was creating jobs. But as somebody who'd never been interested in business, I didn't know how to create jobs. And I started learning about entrepreneurship, and it opened this world to me, because I had always assumed entrepreneurship was just about business and Wall Street. I had equated it with Wall Street and making money. And yet when I started to learn about entrepreneurship, what I realized is that it's something completely different. It's about men and women taking an idea, setting out to build a business, whether it's a product or a service, and really working to disrupt, whether it's models, and create jobs and generate wealth for people that, whether they're in Turkey or in Silicon Valley or Toronto or in Lagos, that they're really trying to actually add value and solve problems around the world. When I discovered that this is what entrepreneurship was, I thought, wow, this is a story that people need to hear. And that they need to hear that it's not happening only in Silicon Valley, that it's happening around the world.
So how did the idea for the book come? Because you were doing this work already and you were seeing these stories and inspired by your own story of your parents. So how did you get pen to paper? How did that process begin? That you actually said, okay, I'm writing this book and I'm starting now. What was that catalyst? How did that happen? How did that come about?
Well, I'd always been a storyteller. I would always been very good about putting thoughts down and writing essays, and it was something that I excelled at. And so I'd always been interested in writing. And so when I made this discovery, a lot of my friends who were fellow writers said, you should really write about the men and women that you meet around the world. interestingly enough, initially, the idea for the book is actually, the book that we have today is totally different from the idea that I set out with. The idea I set out with was writing about men and women solving problems and creating a book where you're really looking at whether it's healthcare or education or poverty alleviation and writing a book about development. As I actually started doing the interviews and traveling around the world and looking at what it was that these men and women were doing, I discovered that they were doing things that were on par with Silicon Valley. And what got me really excited was that people always assume that when you say entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley, it always equals Steve Jobs, it equals Google, Facebook, and it's tech. And what I discovered was that there were men and women around the world who were doing things that were equally as compelling, but people didn't know about their stories. And so it started from doing something about talking about how people were changing the world and solving world problems came to be, how can I tell the story about how Silicon Valley has gone global? I love it.
I love it. How long did it take you from the moment you began until the book was complete and, I don't want to say published, that you completed the book, so the writing process? How long did that take you?
So,
do you think?
From start to finish, I think it was a process of 5 years.
Okay.
I've always wanted to write a book, but starting out with the idea, conceiving it, and then developing it, that actually took, it was a 2-year process of developing this idea, really then talking to people who were in the publishing world and really understanding what it involves writing a book. And there's a lot involved in it that I learned about through this process. You may have an idea, but there are actually experts out there who are in the publishing world and who are doing this professionally that really understand what will interest the public in terms of the message that you're saying. What's interesting is that even though I started with this idea of trying to write about social entrepreneurs and men and women who are changing the world, inherently my message did not change. I worked with my agent in New York who really guided me and showed me that I needed to actually just turn the message around a little bit and present it in a different way, so that it wasn't so heavy about development and poverty alleviation, but that it had a lot more interesting elements that people, wherever they were, could actually understand about how entrepreneurs function around the world, which was, at the end, I actually have to say that I actually think the book now is far more useful because it's a practical guide to entrepreneurship wherever you are.
That is a great point. I have started reading. I'm on the 2nd chapter, but even in the 1st chapter, I was thinking about things I could share with my husband. He's an engineer, things just about changing the culture of the workplace where you're at. So I can relate to that and appreciate that it is something a lot of people can learn from in that way. So I appreciate then that these people in the publishing business that you mentioned, that they guide you. Your message didn't change, but the way you presented it changed.
Yeah, and
so
I think that what I realized is I had a message and I wanted to tell it from my point of view, and what I wasn't thinking about was the audience. And what my agent and the publishing company I worked for actually made me realize is that you actually have to write something that is relevant to people. It has to compel an individual to want to pick up your book. Because if you think about it, when I go to pick up a book, I want to gain some insight about me, and I want it to help me and be relevant to my life in some way. And so while I think all of us have a book inside of us, and all of us have a story, we have to make sure that we're translating that story in a way that a total stranger from the other side of the world can gain something out of it.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about some of the obstacles you faced in writing the book and how you overcame them? Or maybe one, the biggest one, or just some examples about how you worked through challenges or obstacles that came up for you in the process.
Book writing is a really intimidating and lonely process. I think unlike an entrepreneurial adventure where you are forced to actually work with other people and build teams and work with people trying to raise finances, book writing is very solitary. It's something that you actually have to do by yourself. That being said, I did interview the men and women in my book, and I traveled around the world, and so I was constantly interacting with people. But I think the biggest obstacle for me in writing the book was the demons and the voices in my own head that were always second guessing what I was doing. There's no formula to writing a book. Everybody has their own voice and their own style, I think, as they do as individuals in everyday life. And because there's no formula for it, one is always faced with the question of, what am I doing? Is it right? And so there was a lot of fear that I had to face and overcome. So I think on a psychological level, that was one of the biggest obstacles. I think the other obstacles of writing a book is finding the time and having the discipline to actually sit down every day to write it, even when you feel like you have nothing to say. And it's a process of forcing yourself to actually say, I'm going to put out 200 words today, or I have this goal of just telling this part of the story, and forcing yourself to do it. And then finding the time, especially if you do have a full-time job or you have a family and you have other commitments, really trying to juggle those and carve out the time for the book, because the book in many ways is like another family member.
Sure.
It's something that it's a living creature, and you have to devote time to it. And so I think that was actually another physical obstacle that I had to overcome. For me, overcoming those obstacles really meant just telling myself that it was about progress, not perfection. And that even though I sat down today and I felt like what I was writing was not good, that at least I was moving the needle forward. And it was about you don't climb Mount Everest in a day.
Elmira, you were talking about some of the mental obstacles, and you were just moving into some of the physical obstacles that you also had to overcome in the process of writing this book. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Book writing involves time, and that's something I think people struggle with carving out. It also requires discipline. And while it sounds very exciting to write a book, actually finding the time and the discipline to actually sit down and do it, it is very challenging. Part of the challenge is also the psychological intimidation of, do I know what I'm doing? But often when you're writing a book, you're also doing other things simultaneously. I think a lot of people don't have the luxury of just being able to write a book. People have jobs, people have families, people have lives, and being able to sort out your schedule in order to carve that time, it is a challenge. And you have to actually protect it, because you have to treat book writing as if it is a baby. It's a member of your family. It's something that you have to take care of, and really understanding that it does need care and attention. So whether it's in the morning that you carve out the time, or in the afternoon, or in my case, I actually found that I write the best really late at night, and protecting that time and making sure that you could do that. I talked a little bit about putting one foot in front of the other, and really embracing the mantra of progress, not perfection. Making sure that I didn't get intimidated by what I wasn't accomplishing, by really focusing on what I was accomplishing, and really focusing in on that and measuring that, but also really taking stock and saying, what are the things that I have to cut out of my life? When people have babies, that's a life change. When you get a pet, it's a life change, and you have to alter your life in many ways. When you're writing a book, you have to alter your life. There's not a lot of late night going out. You have to really be fresh. You have to have a fresh mind. So there's a lot of things that you miss out on. And you have to be very disciplined about saying to people, no, I can't meet you, or I can't go to that party, or I can't go to that event, because you are doing this process. You have to know that you're doing it for a finite period of time, and really protect that. It's really hard, I have to say. There's a lot of what we call FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And it does take a lot of discipline, but if you're really committed to the book writing process, it's something that you really have to embrace.
Great. We talked about the book like a baby, like having a baby. And they all, there's the saying that it takes a village to raise one. And in the acknowledgments of your book, you list many, many people who supported you in this process. Who would you say was part of your success team? So if there's another woman and she wants to write a book, who was supportive of you in the process? You mentioned your agent, people in the publishing industry, friends of yours that were writers. I'm sure your family. Well, I'll let you answer that question. Who can you say really helped you in the process of birthing this baby, producing this book?
A lot of people, and it does take a village. And while the actual process and act of writing is solitary and it's something that only you as the author can do, it's not something that you should consider being isolated. And
Great.
so I did reach out to a lot of people. I asked people to read early drafts, which is very intimidating because those drafts, I have to say, were terrible and they were not finished products. But if I didn't have the courage to actually go to someone and say, this is a first draft of something that I did, it's not very good, but would you take the time to read through it? I don't think that I could have as good a book as I do believe that I have today.
Okay.
So you have to actually really have the courage and know that, and swallow kind of the embarrassment and not believe that everything has to be perfect. Things are not perfect. Things take a process, and it does take a new set of eyes to actually look at something. What I realized by doing that and sharing my work is that people helped show me things that I wasn't seeing. And they helped me bring me to a light. And so it's so important to actually share your work with people, even if it's not perfect, and get them involved in it. You were also very helpful in my process of actually having the courage to set out to write a book and really understanding what my goals were and how I would go about to do it. And so I do recommend to anyone who's writing a book to have a guide and to have an agent or a coach that is actually holding your hand and someone that you can turn to when you do have a lot of questions and there's a lot of self-doubt and there's a lot of uncertainty in what you're doing. Having that outside cheerleader and coach there is so essential to the writing process.
Good. Well, I was happy to support you in that. It was a pleasure for me and really a joy to see what you created as the result of all your hard work. In the process of writing the book, you co-founded Foreign Policy Interrupted with your partner, Lauren Bone. And I went to a talk that Lauren gave, and she said, as a journalist, when we're reporting on an event or we're interviewing a person, we don't give them a voice. They have a voice. We give them the microphone. And I love that. It's a very empowered stance that you are just bringing a highlight to this person or this event. And I notice on your website, too, you talk about the amplification of women's voices in the work that you do. Can you talk a little bit about Foreign Policy Interrupted, what that is, and what you and Lauren are doing with that organization?
Sure. Foreign Policy Interrupted is a media education platform that Lauren and I created in 2014. We had been talking about the challenges that we as women in the foreign policy world face in trying to get attention to our ideas and getting a seat at the table. I think Lauren and I are both people that are doers. We don't want to complain and join the chorus of people who want to point out that there's a problem in the media. I think especially for me, as somebody who has spent the past 10 years looking at entrepreneurs, I'm much more interested in how do you solve a problem. And so Lauren and I came together and we thought, okay, well, what is the problem? The problem, I think, is two-part. One is a lot of women are not raising their hands, even though Lauren and I know hundreds of amazingly qualified women who are in the foreign policy space. I think a lot of us aren't volunteering for the opportunities to either be on television or pitch to the New York Times. We're waiting to be perfect. I think the second problem is that the media, which was created in the 20th century by a lot of white men, continues to have the same framework and the institutions that it did in the 20th century. And so you continue to see the same white male faces commenting on television and on the op-ed page. What we decided to do was tackle those two various issues by providing media training and just coaching for women to enable them to have the tools to be able to raise their hand and to pitch the New York Times and to say to Charlie Rose, I can be on your show, but then also working with the media outlets to say, hey, we've got a whole cadre of women that you can tap into as sources and people that you can have appear on your op-ed page and on your television program to add diverse voices. What we want to do with Foreign Policy Interrupted is not having women at the table for women's sake, but to actually diversify the ideas and the voices that are there. The 21st century is it's a very different beast. There are more challenges out there. It's much more dynamic. We see information now being sent around the world instantaneously. So no longer is something that happens in Syria then communicated on a government level back to Washington, and they hear it first, and then they get the opportunity to reply to it. We get the information at the same time the policymakers do. And so when you're in a dynamic environment like that, you need to have dynamic and immediate solutions. The more contributors you have to that, the quicker you're going to get to those solutions. So our goal is really to actually enrich the discussions and get to the solutions quicker.
Well, I think you just answered my next question, which was what kind of results, what kind of transformations have you seen when women don't wait to be invited, but when they raise their hand and they say, I have a conversation, I have a message, I have information that will enrich this discussion. So I think you answered that a little bit, but maybe you can give an example. I think you did your first fellowship recently, or you're in the process of that. What kinds of transformations have you seen in the women when they don't wait to be picked, when they raise their hand and they say yes to appearing on television, when they say yes to and they're saying yes to themselves. I mean, not saying yes to the invitation, but they're saying, I have something to say and I'm available to say it. What kinds of transformations do you see in the women when they take that position?
It's interesting because when Lauren and I started, I think Lauren and I started from a place where we both had the same challenges of, is it okay for me to raise my hand and volunteer myself? Is it okay if I pitch the New York Times? And the answer is yes. There's no reason that you can't do it. A male who is our peers, they don't hesitate to do it. They don't hesitate to do it because the system has been created by them for them. And it's a matter of, I think, everyone, both men and women, to actually change it. So I spent a long time writing this book about entrepreneurs. The one thing that I learned from them is they're disruptors. They change the status quo. They challenge what's out there. And they say, just because something we did yesterday doesn't mean we have to do it tomorrow. And so right. I think what we've realized with doing the fellowship program, where we select women that we will provide media training to and then connect them to media outlets where they will have the exposure of working with the media outlets, is that the women that we've selected as well face the same challenges. They have the same notions about what the media is in their heads. And the most common thing that we saw with our 4 fellows was, well, I always wonder if I'm doing the right thing. The reality is there's no right or wrong. If you are a substantive expert, whether it's in China or nuclear issues or in Russia, then it's what your expertise brings. There's no style to it. Just because white men were doing it one way doesn't mean that you actually have to replicate that. And so what we're doing is changing the mind frame of the women, but also the media outlets, to really understand that there are no rules, and it's time to actually break those rules and allow women to raise their hands and to be contributors to television and media and to seminars and forums.
Well, I think that's very, very forward thinking, not even futuristic. That is now, that there are no rules, that people get to do it the way they want. I say they get to do it the way they desire. I say that about a book too, that however you feel compelled to get this message out, that's the right way for you.
Absolutely. So, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think that I think all of us have unique different styles. We enjoy different foods and, different things, activities to do. I think book writing is the same way. You have to make it a reflection of who you are as a person. And so Hemingway is very different than Jane Austen. And, they have different writing styles, but both are wonderful. Right. And you just have to make yourself come out in the book.
Great. Okay, so with that, you've given a lot of advice, but as we finish up here, for women who are at the beginning of a book writing process, they're unsure about how to begin, they feel compelled to share this message. What advice would you give them at the beginning of this process for women who are uncertain?
I think the biggest thing that I can say is to find a community.
Great.
I think that while, again, book writing is a solitary endeavor, I think it does require a community. I think that you can easily get intimidated and overwhelmed by the process of writing a book, because it will require you to go through many drafts, and in many ways it's tiring. And so to have the community there to cheer you on and to serve as a reference to let you know how you're doing, and for them to show you how far you've come. I think a lot of us don't take stock in, we always look at the road ahead and say, oh my gosh, how much further is there to go? But if you actually turn around and you say, wow, look at how far I've come, it's really encouraging and amazing. And so the book writing process is very much like that too. I have to say, even a year ago, I could not envision having a finished product book, because at every turn there's an opportunity to change a sentence and move a paragraph and add a comma and change the different words. There needs to be a point where you know that it's enough. You have to actually close the book at some certain point and let it go out into the world. And I'm happy that I did, because I'm very proud of the product that I've put out.
And you should be.
Thank you.
And you should be. Well, would you have done anything differently? Or for your next book, how would you change the process? Maybe you wouldn't.
I don't think I've learned a lot about writing a book through this process, and I think the book that I wrote was probably the most difficult of all books, because it required me doing a lot of research on topics that I didn't know about. And so the book starts out in Turkey, which I'm very familiar with, and so that was probably the easiest chapter for me to write. But then I went around to Nigeria, Pakistan, Mexico, India, Russia, and China. And those are countries I don't know as well. And so it required me to go and really understand the economies of those countries and the history, and really understand the cultures, and also learn about the various industries that the entrepreneurs were working on. I'm not an expert in mobile money. I'm not an expert in healthcare. I'm not an expert in energy. And so it took a long time for me to actually really get in and understand all of those disciplines, and then actually to write the book. I think in terms of people writing the book, write what you know, but write what you're passionate about, and move it forward in that way. I think for me, it's always, again, it's about the discipline and carving out the time to write the book. What I would change is how I prepared for the book launch. And that was something that people didn't prepare me for. I think people are so intimidated by the actual act of birthing a book and getting it out there that they don't actually really spend time and thinking about how do you actually then move it out into the world, because you're writing a book so that people can read it.
That's right.
And if I could actually do it again, I would actually spend a lot more time in rolling out a plan and a process for how I would reach the audiences I wanted to reach, and thinking about how I would actually promote my book. And that's the one thing I'm going to do for my next book.
That's great. And as I'm thinking about it, after you've just given birth to this book, the last thing you want to do is go launch it. Your energy is spent, right? I mean, if I'm thinking about a woman who's just given birth and she's just come out of labor, the last thing she wants to go do is go, she needs to rest, she needs to recuperate, she needs to gather her energy back, right? But if you have, before that point, your plan in place and your team, if you have people there to help you, then it makes the process that much easier that you can focus on. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, it is. You. It is. Yeah, I haven't had a moment to actually rest. And it's been hard. I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, there are days where I'm really demoralized. And it's really hard because I feel like I've spent so much of my time for the past 5 years writing this book, and it seems like no one cares. But I managed to channel that positive energy that got me through to over the finish line to actually produce the actual physical book, Progress Not Perfection. And so I really try to really grasp onto that and move forward. And the other thing that friends have been helpful in reminding me about is it's the long game. The book is here. It doesn't go away.
That's right.
And so just because it came out a few weeks ago and no one's paying attention to it doesn't mean that they won't pay attention to it 6 months from now or a year from now. And I I do have the opportunity to actually create plans around certain events where I can actually promote it and let people know about my book.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, there were many people who wanted to be here today to hear you speak about this book. So I wanted to keep it just between you and me, but I know this is a great resource for many people, myself included. And so I'm really happy that you got to the end and are now at this place. And with that, I'll have one final question. What was the most joyful part of writing this book for you?
Oh, that's so easy, and I put it in my acknowledgments. Traveling around the world and meeting people, that was the best part of this book. And I'm so glad I went on this journey, because we see the world through Twitter or Facebook or CNN and behind a screen. And it's so different when you go out into the world and actually meet people. All of your notions and your stereotypes are shattered. And you really see how we're all human. And we all want the same things. We all have hopes and desires. And while I think I'm not Pollyannish, I think that there's a lot of bad in this world. I have to say, I think that at the end of the day, I think there's more good. And I saw that traveling around the world. I saw the humanity in people and the desire to help. And it was so beautiful. And that was the most joyful thing to see, and to see, whether it was in Nigeria or Pakistan or in India or in China, how they're the same people as we are here, whether it's in Istanbul, Turkey, or Brooklyn, New York. And that was the most wonderful thing to see.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that is what happens when a woman raises her hand and says yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that because that is what now we all get to get from the book, is that experience that you had the courage to take and share with us. So I'm so thankful. I'm thankful that you set aside time to be with me today, Elmira, because I know you're here for just a very short time in Istanbul. But I'm very, very excited for now what comes. You know, I say the book is not the end, it's the beginning. And so I'm really, really excited to see what happens for you going forward. And I know that women who are thinking about writing a book or just starting the process, you've shared a lot of good wisdom, experience that they can take with them. So thank you for that too.
Well, thank you, Tara. And I mean, I think for the women out there, I think everyone should write their story. Everyone has a book in them. Yeah. And they should be out there, because everyone's voice matters. And you can't think that it has to be on the New York Times bestseller list. It can be a bestseller within your community. And that's the most important thing to keep in perspective, is to not let your voice drown out because you don't think it's going to be the bestseller in the New York Times. It has to be a bestseller in the community and the contributions that you're going to do. One of the things that actually propelled me to writing this book, in addition to working with you and other people, was something that my mother said to me. When I said I was thinking about writing a book, and I said, well, I can't write a book, that's a ridiculous idea. And my mother said, why? And I said, well, who would want to listen to what I had to say? And my mother said, I would. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you explain things to me in a way where that I'm interested. And she said, I watch television, but I don't understand when they talk about entrepreneurship. And she said, you explain it in a way that I understand. And she said, and I am interested. And she said, I want you to write the book for me so that I can hear about the stories around the world. Great
example. Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us. I hope that this was helpful, and we will see you next time when I talk to more women writing books.